Hello and good afternoon to everyone that is joining us. Thank you for joining the Mocha and Many Threads on Fabric Truth Talk session this evening. My name is Cordelia Anthony. I am a NYSIT member and a local president in Farmingdale, New York, and a member of the NYSIT Board of Directors. At this time, we will be doing an acknowledgement. Our land acknowledgement says, we begin by acknowledging that we meet on the traditional land served by the first people. We honor America's indigenous people. We learn from all elders, past, present, and emerging. We are called on to share what we learn about the tribal history, culture, and contributions that have been suppressed in telling the story of America. We invite you to think about the spaces you are inhabiting and the indigenous people who came before them and were stewards of the land. We will also be sharing NYSIT Code of Conduct. The NYSIT Board of Directors has adopted a NYSIT Code of Conduct, which prohibits discriminatory, harassing, or otherwise unacceptable behavior at any NYSIT activity, event, or meeting, even if the conduct has not risen to the level of a violation of law. NYSIT is committed to providing a positive and respectful environment that is free of discrimination and harassment, regardless of an individual's race, ethnicity, religion, color, sex, age, national origin, sexual orientation, disability, gender identity or expression, ancestry, pregnancy, or any other characteristic protected by law. We ask all meeting participants to conduct themselves consistent with the values of equity and equality. Tyrone Hendricks, Executive Director, is the designated point person for anyone who thinks they have experienced discriminatory, harassing, or otherwise unacceptable behavior at this meeting. I urge you to contact Tyrone if you have any concerns. Tyrone Hendricks' email is tyrone.hendricks@nysit.org. At this time, we will hear from our NYSIT Secretary Treasurer, Philippe Abraham, who's also the chair of both the Civil and Human Rights and LGBTQ+ committees.
Thank you, Cordelia, and good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us for Truth Talks. This series is dedicated to raising historical awareness by shining a light on the invaluable contributions of diverse communities, especially those whose stories have been overlooked or marginalized. We are proud to host this discussion as part of our commitment to truth, justice, and an inclusive understanding of history. As a union representing educators, healthcare workers, and other professionals, we believe that knowledge is power and that our collective strength grows when we acknowledge and honor the full scope of history. Our work in advocating for social justice, labor rights, and education equity is deeply connected to the struggles of Black workers whose fights for fairness have shaped labor movements and strengthened the pursuit of economic justice for all. NYSIT is committed to ensuring that our members have access to conversations like these, ones that challenge us to reflect, learn, and act in solidarity with all workers. Black History Month is not just about celebration, it is about truth-telling, recognition, and action. It is a time to honor the resilience, leadership, and achievements of Black Americans while also confronting the ongoing injustices that persist today. The labor movement, civil rights movement, and the education system have all been profoundly shaped by Black leadership, and we must continue to uplift these contributions year-round. We are honored to welcome Dr. Alethia Jones from the CUNY School of Labor and Urban Studies, who will lead tonight's discussion. Her talk, To Build a New World, the intersection of Black worker struggles in the quest for universal fairness, will explore the historical and present-day struggles of Black workers in the labor movement. This conversation is vital as we examine how the fight for racial and economic justice is interconnected and what we, as union members and educators, can do to support progress. We hope that tonight's discussion will inspire meaningful reflection and action. Thank you for being here, and now let me pass it back to Cordelia. Cordelia?
Thanks so much, Philippe, for sharing those words with us. As Philippe mentioned, Dr. Alethia Jones joined the CUNY School of Labor and Urban Studies as a distinguished lecturer in labor studies in January 2023 and serves as Director of Civic Engagement and Leadership Development at the Murphy Institute. For 6 years, she directed the Education and Leadership Development Department at 1199 SEIU United Healthcare Workers East, the largest union local in the United States, serving 400,000 members in 5 states. And Dr. Jones has a PhD from Yale and has taught courses such as issues in organizing, labor and immigration, labor and intersectionality, and social movements. If you have any questions throughout her presentation, please send them through the Q&A chat, and Dr. Jones will take some time at the end of her presentation to answer them. At this time, I'll invite Dr. Alethia Jones to begin her presentation, and thank you so much for being with us.
Oh, thank you for having me. Greetings, everyone. I am going to uh, try the share screen feature here. Okay, terrific. Um, so it is a delight to be with you all today. Here's what we will cover in the next hour. I'll start with a bit about me and my background. Then, this being Black History Month, I'll give a slice of Black labor history. Then I'll go to the heart of the talk, which will really take on questions of what I'm calling visions of full personhood. And we'll do it from both Black feminist perspectives as well as dip into the history of Black auto workers in Detroit. And we'll make some linkages to contemporary challenges and then conclude. So, a bit about me. There is a way in which there are two separate tracks of my life. One track started in traditional academia, earning a PhD, studying the politics of immigrant integration and immigrant politics, along with race and ethnicity politics. And that pathway led me to teach at the State University of New York in Albany, so just down the street from NYSET. And as part of that experience, I met Barbara Smith. And Barbara Smith is a legendary social justice activist and icon. She's one of the founding members of the Combahee River Collective, which we'll talk more about. And Barbara lived in Boston, lived in New York, and was living in Albany, New York. And she became an elected official in Albany, New York. And she was approached to write a book about her life. And she asked me to write that book with her. And I enlisted a friend of mine from the Women's Studies Department because my area is political science and public policy. Uh, and we completed what we called a movement memoir, where the book is based in Barbara's life, but it's really about the movements for social justice and social change that she very much played a part of and helped to shape over 40 years. So that's one component of my life. I left SUNY Albany and began working at 1199 SEIU, headquartered in New York City as the education director. Very much for me a dream job. And in that role, came to learn a lot about 1199's history and its particular labor history and its perspective on labor history. I subsequently wrote an article about that, which I'll include in a resource list that I will send after this talk. And so my perspective on labor and labor history, comes through the experience of 1199. I certainly learned about unions as being an urban political scientist, but this was a completely different experience. Here at City University of New York in the School of Labor Studies, uh, when I teach classes, and I teach a class called The Politics of Intersectionality, I teach a class on social movements, but in those classes, I'm really trying to weave together these two different aspects of my life and study and experiences. And the talk today represents that journey and that effort to identify how do these two things relate to each other. Okay, so let's move on. That's a little bit about me. So 1199 takes a lot of pride in being known as Martin Luther King Jr.'s favorite union. Um, he likes all the other ones too, but we were his absolute favorite. We were one of the first unions to invite him to speak. The union consistently did fundraising for his organization and for the movement and offered all sorts of support. And so they see it as a very unique and special relationship. I'd like to have us take a little journey to the March in Washington for Jobs and Freedom. And many of you, as teachers, may already know some of this history, so bear with me. I like to share with the students I teach, who are largely master students in labor studies, the full title of the march, because the Jobs and Freedom part often gets left off. And many of you may know that the original architect of that march is A. Philip Randolph, the legendary leader of the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters. And he originally proposed a march in 1941 and then held off on it. And then it actually came to fruition in 1963. And Bayard Rustin, who is pictured here, there was recently a beautiful telling of the story of the march on Netflix featuring Bayard Rustin and the fact that he was an out gay man. And that was known to all of the organizers at the time. And he was also a special advisor to MLK and really influenced his move towards nonviolence. Uh, as you may recall, after the march occurred and was a resounding success, they then went to the White House to have a meeting with President Kennedy. And it was a historic meeting. This picture under the statue of Abraham Lincoln is of all the attendees of that meeting. And of course, this is the Lorraine Motel, where Martin Luther King Jr. was fatally assassinated, and he did so while supporting and attending the Memphis sanitation workers strike. And this may be well known to all of you, but I like to share it because it's one of the things that we taught at 1199. And I to this day remember one of the really talented organizers coming up to me and saying, I had no idea that he was killed at a labor action. That when I learned labor history, it's very focused on white men. I didn't realize that Black people had such a legacy within labor. I like to use this quote by Dr. King. The two most dynamic and cohesive liberal forces in the country are the labor movement and the Negro freedom movement. Together, we can be architects of democracy. And I want to point out here, he doesn't refer to it as the civil rights movement. He refers to it as the Negro freedom movement, later the Black freedom movement. And I will sometimes make the case that the term civil rights movement is very limiting. It focuses it just on getting a narrow set of legal rights. And I think that's a term that's been assigned to the Black freedom movement to restrict it and to constrain the imagination of what it was for. Because really it was for something much bigger and broader than changing laws, which are important, but it was dreaming much larger than that. And so I want to ask the question as we went through that history, where were the women? Right? We know that, of course, women hold up half the sky, as they say. Women played incredibly important roles in organizing the march. Eleanor Holmes Norton, who's currently in Congress, was one of the student interns who worked on the march. They had ensured all the buses all across the country got booked, got boarded, that people were fed, people had a place to go, right? They very much are key players, but in the general retelling of the march's history, they are often rendered invisible or taken for granted. And there's one woman in particular I want to lift up today. And there she is, Dorothy Height, who was integral, just as Bayard Rustin was, integral to the march and its organization and its execution. The organizers and leaders of the march are typically referred to as the Big Six. But in truth, if we account for Dorothy Height, it's really the Big Seven. And so, again, wanting to be attentive to how do folks who are central and present nevertheless end up being rendered marginal and invisible. This is Dorothy Height on the platform of the March in Washington for Jobs and Freedom. This is as close as she got to the microphone. Not the first time nor the last time that she was in such a position. Women at the march themselves, people will remember that Marian Anderson sung. There was another, we'll see soon enough, there was another singer as well. Rosa Parks gave a few words, as did Daisy Bates. However, their roles were really seen as a sprinkling in, not part of the main course of the march speakers. This is the agenda. So Marian Anderson sings. Most of the women who are listed here are singers. So selection by Eva Jesse. I think there's one more, Mahalia Jackson. They were not keynote speakers in any way. Mrs. Medgar Evers, Merle Evers, actually didn't make it to the march on time. She encountered traffic delays from the airport. And so at the last minute, Daisy Bates was swapped in and spoke for maybe 30 seconds. So you can see overwhelmingly the speakers, all men. And the idea was that there are women in the congregations of these preachers, and there are women who are members of these organizations led by men, and so that is sufficient. I won't add a quote by Dorothy Height to this talk. I will give a link to an article that she wrote about that experience of her participation in the March in Washington, and then there's a link to a recent CBS profile that takes up this topic specifically. So from the 1199 perspective and walking through labor history, and the UAW, I should say, and Walter Reuther were very supportive of the march, and one of the persons that attended the meeting with President Kennedy, in addition to a high-level rabbi and faith leaders. So after the untimely murder of Dr. King, um, Coretta Scott King really stepped in and filled in whenever and wherever she could. From the 1199 perspective, we had strikes on deck in the healthcare industry in the South. This picture is from South Carolina, Charleston, South Carolina, where there was a major strike of hospital workers. Sorry, I can't recall her name, but this woman standing next to Coretta Scott King was an 1199 member in New York City. She was originally from South Carolina, engaged in the Great Migration, worked in hospitals in New York City, and lived through 1199 organizing hospital workers for the first time. And at that time, hospital workers were paid sub-minimum wage. The way in which we may think of farm workers today or fast food workers or even domestic care workers, like they were really treated as disposable. They were expected to be on public assistance. Their jobs were almost as if they were volunteers, actually. So she experienced unionization through 1199 in New York City and then moved back to South Carolina and decided to bring the union with her. And they led this campaign to unionize hospital workers in the South. They also led a similar campaign in Maryland focused on Baltimore. They were successful in Maryland. They were not successful in South Carolina at the time, but it was quite historic and extraordinary to have Black folks standing up for themselves in this way. We often think of the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters. It turns out that there's also a sisterhood with their sisters, wives, aunts, and everyone. And there is a new book on just that topic. It's a little hard to see, but I'll read the title, Marching Together, Women of the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters. And so I'd recommend folks who are interested in that to check that book out. I've recently learned about Black women leading a strike of washerwomen in Atlanta in 1881. And the washerwomen were a multiracial group. And it's an extraordinary example of working class union and female leadership that we tend not to know that much about. But it's increasingly attracting attention. So I'm going to shift now to this question of why are certain groups of people present yet invisible? And this image comes from the Grassroots Power Project in a training that they do on racial capitalism. And they talk about the DNA of racial capitalism and the DNA of the US, but it's truly global, where there are these different strands. Certainly, the economic strand of capitalism, which is based on exploitation. There is the strand that's rooted in racism, that is tied to dispossession, both of indigenous land. And as we know, race itself is socially constructed. It is imagined as a natural category, but it is something created by human beings. And so who is considered to be racialized and can be dispossessed changes over time. So you may know the classic example of the Irish, right, in the 1800s were considered a different race altogether, right? And the work that they did to be accepted and are now considered white. And it's true of other Southern European immigrants as well. One could argue that the contemporary assault that is being waged on undocumented immigrants and fairly soon by extension, all immigrants utilizes some of the same tools, techniques, and language of structural racism. And then patriarchy, right? How do we understand gender and sexuality, and that patriarchal forms of rule have very narrow and traditional categories that are accepted. So these are dominant features in our society. They are often contested, uh, but they certainly exist. So one of the ways in which the sort of invisibility of groups that are present and have contributed to who we are as a nation, as a people, occurred through Black feminists. And as I mentioned, Barbara Smith is one of the leading Black feminists of her era, and they were a co-founder of Kitchen Table Press. And one of the books um, that was published before Kitchen Table Press was created, that brought together the voices of many Black women authors, is this one. And the title really stands out because it captures something very fundamental. All the women are white, all the Blacks are men, but some of us are brave. Black women's studies. And so in this era, before we had the fabulous Toni Morrison, these are the early stages of Alice Walker, right? Actually pulling together material to teach a course on Black women, on the literature that they wrote, was a struggle. They had to do so much original research. And this book is one of the first books that really pulled together key material and talked about that experience and the value of and the importance of actually having a course on Black women's studies and what it means and the politics of what it means to create this kind of work and field of study. You can make out here Audre Lorde's name, as some of you may know. Audre Lorde, very well-known political activist and poet, Black lesbian, was a faculty member at City University of New York at Hunter College. So I love to shout out public universities whenever I can. Identity politics is a term that's really bandied about, but it's a term like intersectionality today that is overly defined by its detractors and people who really want to limit its scope and delegitimize it. So I find it helpful to assign the Combahee River Collective Statement, which is the iconic piece of writing. Recently have said to my students, the class labor intersectionality that I teach would all likelihood be outlawed in Florida under the new laws. Who knows if Florida's laws will spread nationwide. But interestingly enough, the Combahee River Collective Statement itself has remained on the list of acceptable readings, even in the state of Florida. They've outlawed other books by Black women, but not this particular essay. So from that essay, I want to lift up two quotes. First is the definition of identity politics, which reads, "The most general statement of our politics at the present time would be that we are actively committed to struggling against racial, sexual, heterosexual, and class oppression, and see as our particular task the development of an integrated analysis and practice based upon the fact that the major systems of oppression are interlocking." The statement was written in 1973, largely by Barbara Smith in conjunction with two or three other key members of the Combahee River Collective. It's gone on to become quite iconic, and it is the first documented place in print that the term identity politics is actually utilized. And what they meant by it is that they had noticed a lot of the members of the collective had come from other movement spaces. They had participated in the civil rights movement in the South. They had participated in the Black Power movement led by Stokely Carmichael. Um, they had participated in the women's movement with Gloria Steinem and others. And in each of those spaces, they realized that Black women were often sidelined, even though they were making major contributions. And they decided that if they were going to seek the freedom of Black women, they had to do it themselves and they had to be rooted in their own history and articulate their own politics based on their own experiences. Um, that a politics that's dominated by white women or by Black men didn't allow them to fully uh, hone in on what the distinct contribution of Black women were and what they would need it for their own freedom, something that's centered rather than as an extension of someone else's freedom. So that's the nature of their political analysis. And here I mean small p politics, not big P politics as in elections, right? Um, and I often ask my students to come to class with this particular statement with one or two of their favorite quotes. And invariably, almost every student will choose this quote. We might use our position at the bottom, however, to make a clear leap into revolutionary action. If Black women were free, it would mean that everyone else would have to be free, since our freedom would necessitate the destruction of all the systems of oppression. So this is a good time to lift up that the Combahee River Collective understood itself as operating within the Black radical tradition, right? These women had, were scraping together livelihoods by being writers or secretaries. Participating in the collective was an act of political love. It's their 5 to 9, we could say, 5 p.m. to 9 a.m., not their 9 to 5. And so they're doing very grassroots movement building work. And in their analysis, they connect the experiences that they and other Black women have to those strands of the DNA, right, that we saw. What's the economic system? What is the gendered system? What is the racial system? How do those systems all converge to overly determine in a negative way the experiences of Black women? And if we could name those experiences and then imagine a system that actually provided freedom and autonomy, what would that system actually look like? What kind of economy would you design, right? What kind of gender relationships would you design? How would race even exist, right? It might be completely different. So that's what they mean of our freedom would necessitate the destruction of all systems of oppression because they'd be redefining the world, redesigning the world in such a way where that kind of oppression wouldn't exist for them or for anyone else for that matter. So this analysis um, has existed for some time. I think the Combahee River Collective Statement is a very poignant and sharp and concise statement of it. But if you look in the history of Black feminism, Anna Julia Cooper in the late 1800s, sorry, later than that, in the early 1900s, was talking about gender, race, and class. Others are talking about gender, race, and class. However, Kimberly Crenshaw's articulation of this from her perspective as a Black legal academic has really taken hold. And the term she uses is intersectionality. And intersectionality uses the metaphor of the car wreck. and imagining that Black women or other folks who are multiply impacted by different disadvantages, imagine them as sitting at the intersection of a major highway. And if you're an intersectional feminist, what this means is that you're not just at risk of suffering disadvantage based on one criteria, right? If you take into account not only race, but also gender and also physical ability, right? And also sexuality, then it means you are getting hit, right, by vehicles from multiple directions, right? That's the part of the intersectional metaphor, right? Being structurally located at these crossroads, which means that you are vulnerable to being hit and attacked or negatively impacted by multiple different systems and categories. So there are lots of graphic representations of what intersectionality means. And so this one captures the structural, systemic components like classism, ableism, transphobia. So there are more categories that have been added since the Combahee River Collective articulated a statement. So the idea has been extended to others. You know, people say identity politics, but I like to think of them as structural categories of advantage and disadvantage. So then there's an inner layer of how those systems interact with things we're often born into and our opportunities to leverage those into more privileges or fewer privileges. And then these interact with things like our age, our childhood experiences at a really personal and intimate level. So I'm now going to shift because as I, taught this class in labor intersectionality, I thought it was really important for the students whenever possible to read primary documents. So the Combahee River Collective is one such primary document. And I also assigned reading from Kimberly Shaw. And imagine my surprise as I identifying which of her law review articles would be the most accessible to students who are full-time union members and social justice activists who are working all day and then come to school to take class at night. And I found an article that was less a law review, but an essay. It was a blend of the two. And don't you know it, she builds her intersectional argument off legal cases. And these legal cases involve workers. And a key case for her is this one, the Graffin-Reed versus General Motors that was decided in 1976. Right, and so that's the connection to this talk today is the way in which stories of labor are really important to all of this theorizing, right? The Combahee River Collective, those women were all working class. They came from working class backgrounds. They each in different ways were in that first and early wave of Black children or young people who were awarded scholarships to attend predominantly white universities. And they did so, but their commitment to the Black community remained really strong, and they were activists. So let's delve into this case and another, and then we'll start closing out. So the Graffin-Reed versus General Motors. General Motors laid off employees during a recession in 1974, with the last hired, first fired, which meant Black people were disproportionately affected. 5 Black women in particular said that brought a lawsuit to challenge this layoff. And the courts had a very hard time understanding it because they brought the lawsuit as Black women. And as far as the courts were concerned, you could either bring a lawsuit as a Black person or you as a Black man, or you could bring it as a white woman. But the category of like Black woman didn't really make sense to them. Um, and what's important to know is that no women were hired at General Motors before 1964, and no Blacks were hired at General Motors before 1970. And so that's why these Black women made the argument that they're doubly impacted by race and by gender and unfairly disadvantaged as a result. And they filed their lawsuit as Black women, and they did so on behalf of all women employees. And Black women were never promoted to management position. The courts decided that these Black women could not represent white women, that that's not permissible. Nor could they represent Black men. But vice versa is okay. Like white women filing a lawsuit can represent all women, and Black men filing a lawsuit can represent all Blacks, but not the other way around. And the courts ultimately rejected this lawsuit because it said the law never envisioned this combination of Blackness and femaleness. And if it did, it would mean if the courts ruled in their favor, then the courts would be creating what it called a new super remedy of Black women. And so it rejected the case. So what is revealed in this court ruling is that the court often has to decide on using common sense. And when there's a novel area, a new area, it has to extend like the existing body of ruling to this new area. And when you look at these court cases, this is what Kimberly Crenshaw does very well. She then identifies what are the unspoken beliefs, what are the unspoken assumptions about society and how it works and how it should work that gets revealed in these court cases. And so life, as in most things, it's like an iceberg. There are the things that we see on top, and underneath are many, many things that are unspoken, right? But they are playing a really important role. I will have to blaze through the rest of this. I'm so sorry. That iceberg analogy is useful here as well to understand the DNA that we saw earlier and how it works, right? Kimberly Crenshaw is really making the case that if you look at the experiences of Black women, then you will discover all of these other assumptions about how society works. And that they're really taking up and challenging, and through the court, the legal system, seeking a remedy. And in intersectionality, really naming explicitly what the ways in which privileged groups versus targeted, marginalized social groups have a differential relationship to privilege, and then different life expectancies and probabilities and outcomes. And that we actually really need to account for that in society. So I asked the question, what was happening with auto workers in Detroit in the 60s and 70s because of this lawsuit? I became curious, and I'm going to stop this actually. We don't have time for me to play it. But I ended up learning about and now teach about the Dodge Revolutionary Union movement, which was an autonomous group of Black workers within the Dodge plant that really led a wildcat strike that lasted for 3 days with the participation of thousands of Black workers. They really protested the ways in which the relationship between Black workers on the shop floor and the supervisors, to them, kind of recreated the plantation politics of the overseer and deep unfairness. And they also challenged the UAW for not addressing it. They ran an alternative slate, which didn't win, but it really put the UAW on notice. And they had a really big vision, right? They wanted to right a lot of wrongs, both on the shop floor, but also in Detroit politics and government. And they made linkages between the experiences at the workplace and substandard housing, education, poverty, police brutality. So they're a really important moment in Black labor history that we often don't know about. And they had the foresight to create a full hour-long documentary about their movement, which you can find on YouTube. So I want to say that these challenges persist, that there was a recent story in the New York Times in 2017 about sexual harassment and discrimination against women at the Ford plant. And the tools that we use today still involve lawsuits. And so there are contemporary lawsuits facing Google, facing Tesla, facing others, which often lead to settlements, out-of-court settlements, and non-disclosure agreements. And it's a different form of seeking remedy than union organizing or the kinds of grassroots social movement building that Barbara Smith and the Combahee River Collective engaged in. But the reason why we want to have awareness of social locations is because we want to build a different world. And at the end of the day, the demands of Drum, of the Combahee River Collective, and Kimberly Crenshaw, and these lawsuits, is that they're really reaching for a different kind of world, a world where we rebuild the systems that we encounter. We don't just conform to things as they are. We seek to start where we are, but we seek to transform them, informed by a much bigger social vision, so that there can be inclusion for all of us, not just for a privileged few, which is a point I know all of you appreciate. And that fundamentally, if we're going to meet our best and highest aspirations as a society, that it means we have to redesign and rework, right, what is below the waterline of the iceberg. And intersectional analysis enables us to do that by understanding our locations and then seeing how we can create systems that can be more fair for everyone. I'm going to close with two quotes. First, a quote by Martin Luther King Jr. "I've come upon something that disturbs me deeply. We have fought hard and long for integration, as I believe we should have, and I know we will win. But I have come to believe that we're integrating into a burning house," right? And so this is a concern, to not just accept things as they are, because they actually can be pretty bad, and we think it really should be better. And I'll close with Fannie Lou Hamer, an activist in the Black freedom movement in Mississippi. "No, what would I look like fighting for equality with the white man? I don't want to go down that low. I want the true democracy that'll raise me and that white man up and raise America up," right? She wanted to go beyond the kind of violence and exploitation of the dominant system. So sorry the talk went a little bit long, but I'll stop here for any questions.
Thank you so much. We do have a few questions for you that was shared in the Q&A. So I'm going to start with, how do you see the upcoming boycott of several companies on Friday, the last day of Black History Month, and beyond, the impact, the labor force in the urban communities? How do you see that boycott connecting?
Well, clearly, I was so busy working on this keynote presentation, I wasn't aware that there was a boycott being
Well,
organized.
I think there's a few leaders out there that are recommending an economic boycott, like do not buy, do not engage in or support local businesses or Black-owned businesses and so forth, on the last day of Black History Month. So someone's question was, how do you see that kind of boycott connecting with the labor force in the urban communities?
Yeah, I love all of the above strategies. I won't say no to anything. I Historically, boycotts are very hard to be effective, but when they are effective, it really matters. But it helps when it's a sustained boycott. So
Mm.
if you look at Cesar Chavez and the United Farm Workers with the Great Boycott, right? Like that was real work. It took years. They built coalitions. They built visibility. Um, there's the South Africa divestment movement, right?
Right.
Was a boycott. So again, years, sustained, targeted, visible. Uh, so I think yes, let's try it, but it probably will take more for the boycott's message to really resonate.
Gotcha. Thank you. Another participant asked, how do we internally organize a labor force through the lens of current social injustice?
I'm not quite sure what that means.
Um, that's, I guess, how do we organize our union brothers and sisters, our union siblings, considering the current social injustice that's happening may probably be depressing a few of us. So maybe how do we
Oh,
get them
right, yeah.
organized, even though there's so much social injustice happening? Or, I mean, sometimes I guess we can use that as a tool, but maybe not.
Yeah, a rabbi I recently heard said, we can feel angry, we can feel betrayal, we can feel defeat, we can feel sadness, right? Feel all the feelings, but what we cannot afford to feel is stuck.
Hmm.
And, this society specializes in beautiful distractions, and Netflix is a very good one, right? Shopping is another one, right? So when you're in the stuck mode, you often distract yourself. And so, how do we allow ourselves to feel all of that, and have it inform action? There's a saying in union organizing that you don't have to organize workers. Let the boss do the organizing for you,
Hmm.
right? So how do you use the boss's actions to animate workers? So how are you using what they're actually doing to help people see what their true interests are? It's not easy work, but it's worth doing. And we know that 40% is what I've heard bandied about of union members supported Trump,
Right.
right? So not every union sibling um, is necessarily of the same ilk, but you've got to keep the conversation going with people.
Awesome. Thank you. Another question is, can you tell us about the beginning of the Combahee River Collective and why these Black feminists came together?
Yes. They came together because there was a meeting to create the National Black Feminist Organization, right? To push back against the National Organization of Women, which is dominated by white women, upper middle class white women. Women got to law school, with their sharp elbows, and Black women didn't feel well represented there or that their contributions were being overlooked. So, um, so a meeting was called in New York City. Black women from activists from across the country joined and attended the National Black Feminist Organization. And then they left and created satellite chapters all across the country. So the Boston chapter of the National Black Feminist Organization was created. And then a year or so into it, they decided that the MBFO was not as radical as they would like, and it wasn't doing much as they would like. And so they reformed separately as a collective, and they call themselves the Combahee River Collective because Combahee River is where Harriet Tubman, the only female general, in the US Army during the Civil War led a successful assault and and led to freedom 750 enslaved people. So that's why they chose Combahee River in their name, to call attention to the ways in which Black women have been leading this fight and fighting for liberation and freedom for all people, as well as themselves. And they wanted to tap into that tradition. I see there's another question here about how do we highlight Black feminism when discussing intersectionality. Like Nike says, just do it. Now that you know, share the good news.
Absolutely. And
Now you know, share the good news, use the quotes, read it yourself and just make the connection.
absolutely. And then the last question that we're going to take is specific to the name of the documentary about the Dodge plant.
Yes, that's a really good question. It will be in the resource list that I send.
Perfect.
That
Perfect.
I
I
send to you.
appreciate it.
So
Thank you so much.
I think finally got the news.
Finally
For
got
those who can't wait for that. Finally got the
finally.
news, 1970.
Awesome. Thank you so much. All right. So we just want to thank you so much, Dr. Jones, for this enlightening talk and discussion with us. We appreciate your time and for sharing with our participants on this webinar. Upcoming, we're going to have other Truth Talk sessions, and we will be having our next session specific to women's leadership in social movements. Next month, where we'll discuss unsung women leaders as well in the abolitionist, suffragist, and the labor movement, and specifically women of color in the fight for education equity as well. All of these Truth Talk sessions, all the episodes will be located on the NYSET Social Justice webpage under Truth Talks with links to the resources provided by Dr. Jones, as she mentioned, for everyone that will be interested in following up. We also want you to encourage others to incorporate these conversations into their work. Like Dr. Jones said, just do it and make sure that you follow everything that we are doing in the social justice department. So we want to thank you all for your time this evening, and we will see you next month with another Truth Talks discussion.